creepiest real-life story Reddit Iceberg. Today, I'll be ranking some of the creepiest real-life stories posted by Redditors, from the more tame at the top to the utterly disturbing and depraved at the bottom. The last 2 or 3 stories really stuck with me, so buckle up. At the top of the iceberg is Paramedic Dispatch. Working as a paramedic, I was dispatched to what went out as a simple assault call in a bad neighbourhood. This was around 10 PM. We arrived at the address to find a man standing behind a row of parallel parked cars in front of his house, yelling in a strange high-pitched voice. The police were trying to calm him down. Our first assumption, walking up to him, was that this was the guy who was injured, but once we got a look at the gurney around the parked cars, we saw what was really going on. A dead man was leaned up against a Mini Cooper, slouched in the gutter. I'll never forget coming around that car to find him. There was this really unsettling moment that lasted about 2 seconds where I thought he was alive and staring at me. Then I realised he was looking through me, then I realised he was dead. He was shirtless and had been stabbed multiple times, and these were brutal wounds. Most stabbings I'd seen up to that point seemed like simple penetrations, but this guy's chest and abdomen had been torn to shreds. It was nasty. The guy standing on the curb was yelling in that weird warbly voice, crying, asking if his roommate would be okay. We started CPR and scooped him up and took him to the hospital, knowing that there was really no chance for this guy. After the doctor pronounced him, a couple of cops came over from the scene to square away any business involving the victim. One of them really dropped a bomb on us. The story they'd heard before we arrived was that the victim had left the house to have a smoke, and when his roommate came out to check on him, he found him stabbed to death outside. But after we left for the hospital, someone noticed a trail of blood leading from the house to the curb, implying that he'd been stabbed inside. When the police confronted the roommate about this, he managed to run inside and barricade himself in the house. There was actually a SWAT team over there dealing with the situation as we spoke. So, the person who'd brutally murdered our patient that night had been standing there right behind me for most of the call. Pretty creepy. I found it interesting how he can go from passionate murderer, brutally stabbing his roommate multiple times, to unsuspecting bystander, and back at the flip of a switch. Very psychotic behaviour. But I've put this first because I found it not particularly remarkable, and there was very little mystery involved. Second is Mystery Abandoned Car. I'd always parked in a certain spot at my last job for the 12 years that I worked there. One day, my spot's taken by a dark tinted caddy, and I'm immediately pissed because everyone knows it's mine. It's the morning shift, 4 AM, so it can't be one of the others because I know what they drive. So newbie? Or maybe another employee from another shop in the plaza. Anyway, it's still there on my lunch break, and when I go home, and the next day, and the next day, and the next. Something about it really bothered me. It smelled wrong. Literally. It's the south, and high summer, so who knows what's baking in there. My dad always said if you feel something is wrong, then it probably is, so I dialed the non-emergency contact police number. I felt like an idiot, but every time I walked by, it bugged me. The police show. The car is on Amber Alert as the last sighting of a missing person who was a minor. A 15-year-old girl. When they pop the trunk, they find her dead, mutilated body under a blanket and the source of the smell. She'd gone out with her much older, controlling and insecure boyfriend, but had decided to get out of the relationship. She only made the mistake of getting into the car with him. He drove 3 countries over after torturing her, stuffing her in there, and who knows what else. Then parked and walked away, left her to die in the trunk. I never learned her time of death, and it haunts me sometimes thinking that she might have been saved if I'd made a fuss earlier. So yeah, listen to your gut, even if it seems petty. I think it's the idea of unknowingly smelling rotting flesh for days, which puts it above the previous story. But again, just a domestic dispute that went too far. Next is After Party Lurker. I lived in a small college town, and my apartment complex was walking distance from the bar downtown area. One weekday night, I stepped out onto my front porch to smoke a cigarette or two as I was up late studying. I brought my textbook with me and sat down on the stairs while I smoked. A girl, who I'd never met, but who lived one apartment over, but down on the ground floor, came home from downtown. She was by herself, and you could tell from her walk that she'd been drinking. She got in her apartment and barely got the door closed before some guy, who came out of nowhere, knocked on her door. She opened it, and I noticed he introduced himself, which was weird because it was after 2:30 AM. Who comes to a strange girl's apartment at that time? So I decided to stay outside and pay attention. They ended up talking for over 10 minutes. She later acknowledged how weird the situation was, but did not know how to end the conversation. He would do the creepiest things, like he reached up and stroked her hair at least 3 times, and would try and slowly inch his way closer to her and the door. I made a point of being loud with my textbook, so he would know I was there, and he disappeared as eerily as he'd come. We called the cops, and days later they had the girl and me sit with a sketch artist. As soon as the sketch was public, floods of calls came in. The guy turned out to be a serial rapist who followed lone girls home from bars and pretended to be a cab offering them a ride. This girl just got lucky because she lived so close to the bars that he didn't even get a chance to pull the cab routine. Who in their right mind would open their door for someone at 2:30 in the morning? But honestly, thank God you were there. Sandy Island Gravestone. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, my family took a trip to this man-made lake and family park in South Georgia. It was basically a large dugout pond that the owner had tried to turn into a beach. He dumped in a bunch of sand, planted some palm trees, and started charging admission. People would drive in, park, grill, and swim for the day. There was also this big water slide, which, looking back, was incredibly unsafe. Kids got hurt on it all the time. We usually park near a small island about 30 yards from the shore, which was basically a raised patch of sand in the middle of the water. I wasn't a great swimmer, but the water was just deep enough that I could bounce off the bottom and kind of bob my way out to the island. One day, while doing just that, bouncing my way out to the island, I suddenly stepped on something that felt wrong. It felt like a face. My toe brushed over what seemed like a nose, and then I felt hair. Long, fine hair, drifting between my toes in the water. I froze. I was terrified. I had no idea what it was, but something about it really shook me. I got out of the water and just sat on the shore, freaked out, not really understanding what I'd felt. Later that day, I remember parents shouting, calling out the kid's name, asking if anyone had seen the little boy. They ended up pulling his body from the water, right there in front of that little island. I'm 47 now, and I still remember the feeling of that hair slipping between my toes. It's something I'll never forget. I've put this one in the middle, as I can imagine the terror of being the person to discover that, followed by everyone scrambling, and mixed with childlike innocence, is a recipe that could haunt someone for a very long time. Nightmare Home Intruder. In a cold winter night in a remote village in Quebec, Canada, in 1990, me and my 2 brothers were asleep. We were 1, 3 and 6 years old. In the middle of the night, someone entered our house without knocking, walked around and was talking to himself. Our house was 2 miles from any village in a rural area. My father woke up and went to the living room where the guy was. He'd had a car accident 1 mile from our house with his buddy who had died instantly, and this guy's scalp had fallen in front of his face. So the first time my father saw him, he saw a man with no face. He was drunk and his body was frozen. He was speaking to himself, saying, "I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die." The fact his face was partially frozen might have saved his life, preventing him from losing too much blood. My father took him to the hospital 25 kilometers away, and he did survive. To this day, my father is still blessing the fact that we never woke up during the night with all the noise. Adult or not, that sounds like pure nightmare fuel. I would need therapy after walking in on that in the middle of the night. The next one is Sleep Paralysis Neighbour, and we're really starting to get dark with this one. A few years back, I rented an apartment from a friend of mine. He'd recently bought it and had it completely renovated. He put it up for sale, but couldn't find a buyer, so I offered to rent it in the meantime. After moving in, I realised there was something wrong with the lady next door. She was about 45 but looked much older. She would sit up all night listening to Christian radio shows and talking loudly to someone. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep, so I went over to her place and asked her to keep it down. She opened her door and I got a quick peek. Her walls all had crosses painted on them in different colours, and words like Jesus and angels scribbled everywhere. The windows were painted black, letting no light in at all. It was damp, yellow-stained 50-year-old carpets, dog shit and cockroaches everywhere. No dog though. So I asked her to keep it down. She just looked at me and then shut the door. Then she turned up the radio even louder. The next night I had my partner staying over. I wake up in the middle of the night and see a shadow of a person next to the bed looking at us sleeping. I think I'm hallucinating, as I usually do in the dark when I'm sleepy. But then the shadow starts talking. It's my neighbour, and she's holding something in her hand. She broke in during the night and who knows how long she stood there. "You should lock your door at night," she says, and then just walks out. The next morning, I hear someone making strange noises below my bedroom window. It's my neighbour, talking to herself in tongues. She has a plastic bag in her hand, with her rotting dead dog inside. It's hot as hell outside and I can smell death from that bag. At this point, I'm scared shitless. She is obviously very insane. I go upstairs and knock on another person's door and ask what the hell is going on. The guy is as scared as me. Apparently she broke into his apartment one evening as well while he was watching TV with his kids. He got up from the couch to get a snack, only to find her behind the couch staring at him holding a power drill. Now I know what she was holding in her hand. At this stage I'm basically pooping myself. I call the cops and they know all about her. Apparently she is a violent schizo and she hasn't taken her meds. But they can't force her or enter her apartment without her permission because she owns it. The only thing they can do is get her when she goes outside. So I sit up for the next 2 days waiting for her to run out of cigarettes. When I hear her leave at 2 AM to go across the road to the 7-Eleven, I call the cops. They have 3 cars and a special van over in less than 2 minutes. They restrain her and throw her in the van and drive off to some institution, and in less than a minute, it's like she was never there. I never saw her again. Still have nightmares about her looking at me in my sleep though. I think regardless of this encounter, you should probably take her advice and lock your door at night. The only reason I didn't put this one lower is because she hadn't proved that she was actually dangerous. She makes a great night hag or whatever, but these appearances with a power drill could have just been threats, so people leave her alone. The case of Septic Tank Sam. In April 1977, a farmer near Tofield, Alberta, hired workers to clean out an abandoned septic tank on his property. Instead of waste, they discovered the remains of a man. The police determined he was between 26 and 32 years old. Because no one came forward to identify him, investigators nicknamed him Septic Tank Sam. Which feels so sardonic considering how brutal the incident was. The autopsy revealed he'd suffered prolonged and brutal torture before his death. He'd been bound, burned with a blowtorch, sexually assaulted with objects, and beaten. Finally, he was shot multiple times and his body was dumped into a septic tank to conceal the crime. The severity of his injuries suggested his killers wanted him to suffer and made efforts to erase his identity. Despite extensive investigation, including checks of dental records and later forensic reconstructions of his face, the man's identity has never been confirmed. Advances in forensic science have led to his remains being exhumed for further testing, but even decades later, the case remains one of Canada's most disturbing and enduring unsolved murders. What put this story so low for me is the absolute horror that went into the murder, combined with the indignity of being discarded in a septic tank for waste, and having all possible forms of identity wiped. Imagine dying the most painful death possible and nobody even knowing who you were. Really sends a chill down my spine. There are some seriously evil people out there. Finally, in the deep depths under the iceberg is the Porcelain Doll. I grew up in North Dakota, and back in high school, a group of us got into researching old murder cases in the country. We'd go out at night, find the locations, and film ourselves exploring. Kind of our own creepy adventures, about 2 years before the Blair Witch Project. Mostly, it was just an excuse to get drunk on cheap beer and do something reckless. Eventually, we ran out of crime scenes. North Dakota isn't exactly packed with murders, so we started searching for abandoned rural farmhouses instead. We got pretty good at it, learning to spot signs like overgrown groves, rut roads, and old mailbox posts. One night, we saw a tree grove that looked out of place. We followed a rough path through a field and found an old, but not ancient, farmhouse. The exterior doors were padlocked, but they came off easily. There were 6 of us, all with flashlights, and we entered through the kitchen. Right away, the dining table stood out. It was completely set for a meal. Everything was in place. That was odd. We'd been through dozens of these places and had never seen anything like that before. Even weirder, the fridge still had old rotting food. The cupboards were fully stocked, mail was on the counter postmarked June 1978, a TV guide with UFOs on the cover sat in the living room, photos hung on the walls, mum, dad, son, daughter, all very 1970s. Closets were full, furniture was in good condition, just dusty. The whole place looked like the family had just stepped out and never came back. It wasn't even packed up, it was abandoned mid-life. We split up to explore upstairs. My group took the nearest room, which turned out to be the young boys. But before we could really look around, a blood-curdling scream came from down the hall. We ran out and found the 2 who'd screamed. All they said was, "You have to see it." We followed them to a bedroom where, directly across from the door, propped up on pillows in a neatly made bed, was a life-sized porcelain doll. White skin, black hair, cold glass eyes, and worst of all, its head was turned slightly, positioned perfectly to stare at the door. At us. As if it had been waiting for someone to walk in, for 20 years. We bolted. On the drive back, the dread sank in deeper. Someone had taken the time to set that doll up, in a house left full of food, clothes, mail, and memories. They made sure to pose that doll before leaving, like it mattered more than anything else. We tried researching the family, names, records, accidents, obituaries, but found nothing. No tragedy, no story, no relatives. Just a forgotten house lost in time. County records showed the land was repossessed for unpaid taxes, which explains the locks, but we never found out what really happened, or why the last thing left behind was that doll. This is the final story on our iceberg for the main fact that I cannot understand what could have happened here. I just can't get in the mindset of a family in the 70s who would leave everything at the drop of a hat, but arrange this doll to stare at the door. Like, it's the only purposeful thing done before leaving. So easy to speculate. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've managed to find some enjoyment out of this. Please leave a comment if you have any true creepy stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.